What up, Doe? Oxford English Dictionary. Jim Crow. From 1828, the name of an early 19th century song originating among enslaved black people in the southern United States. And mind you, 1828 is not that far back. I, for one, know that many people think when they hear 1828 and they hear enslaved or slave, they don't take into consideration that the word slave is synonymous with worker, laborer, employee. The realization of this comes when you know who your family is, know the migrations of your family around this soil portion that is termed North America. Specifically, what is termed the Southern United States. I know where my family was in 1828. And yes, they worked. They worked for themselves. They worked on a farm, what was called a farm, something where you basically are self-sufficient and take care of you and your family and your extended family. So when you see enslaved black people, understand this is a hijack. Because I'm sure if each one of you started doing your genealogy, tracing your family through records, you would find that in 1828, there were no Kunta Kintes with neck braces and wrist shackles and ankle shackles. That's Easter Bunny stuff. That's Tooth Fairy stuff. We're talking Jim Crow, the name of an early 19th century song. And to this day, when you say the word Jim Crow, the only thing people think about is a fictitious slave narrative that they've been given. The name of an early 19th century song originating among enslaved black people in the southern United States, or properly Americans in the southern United States, more specifically indigenous Americans of the southern United States. Yo grandmama, yo grandfather, yo family, yo cousins, yo aunties, uncles. A theatrical version of the song or an accompanying dance performed by a white person in blackface, representing derogatory stereotypes of black people, now historical. They say derogatory stereotypes. More specifically, white people with black paint on their faces, dancing around and singing and trying to speak like the people of the southern United States, of the southern American soil. The song, also sometimes known as Jump Jim Crow, includes the refrain, I wheel about, I jump about, I do just so, and every time I jump about, I jump Jim Crow. The actor T.D. Rice developed and popularized a stage routine performing the song, which was subsequently adapted by other minstrel performers. A name for a black person, or a name for an American person. From 1840, any of various tools and machines often characterized by a facility for changing position or direction of working, railways, an implement for bending or straightening rails by applying pressure with a screw. From 1903, the system of laws or practices which enforced segregation of black people in the southern states of the United States until the mid 20th century. A system of laws or practices which enforced segregation of black people or segregation of indigenous American people from the South. They say segregation, but in fact, people were living where they were living, and they were keeping to themselves and their families. Just because people didn't interact with one another at the level that some might have thought they should, whatever governmental body was in place thought they should, for ulterior motives, for other reasons. The propaganda would suggest that segregation was a bad thing. For instance, the lunch counter situation that was propagandized or set up like a Hollywood scene, where it was a big thing for Americans, who you might term black people, to sit at a lunch counter and be served in a, quote, white diner. More properly, Anglo-Saxon or Anglos or Caucasians or Europeans and such. This was perpetuated partly by people who look like you. Why was it so important for you to go sit in somebody's diner who didn't want you to sit there? And do we know actually why they didn't want someone who looked like you to sit at their counter? Maybe they had a reason. It reminds me of the colored and white water fountains that people would put on the outside of their establishment. Who cares if they had separate water fountains? Today, they have separate restrooms. And I'm not speaking of the restroom for the male and female. I'm speaking of the third restroom that's being proposed. A colored water fountain, a white water fountain. The system of laws, practices, or practices which enforced segregation. I'd have to look up what laws those were that enforced people to stay away from each other. If I had to guess, I would say that if you are a so-called pink or gray person, or Anglo-Saxon or Anglo or Caucasian, and you set up a business, or if you were an indigenous American or what you would term black, and you set up your own business, and certain people weren't allowed in, that would be considered segregation, I guess. But in my estimation, it would be people doing what they want to do. segregation of or discrimination against black people under this system or in a manner likened to this system. Most laws enforcing racial segregation in the southern states were enacted in the late 19th century following the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery under the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Jim Crow legislation was overturned in the 1950s and 60s as a result of the civil rights movement. I'm not sure which laws actually said that segregated black people. I don't know if they mean sitting on the back of the bus, but I don't see that as a problem. For as long as I can remember, we've always went to the back of the bus anyway. Even, when I was in high school, we went to the back of the bus when we were going to school. But however, I don't see that as an issue, because if you have an issue with the way the bus system is functioning, you start your own bus system, which a lot of our people did. A lot of our people had taxi services and ride sharing and things of that nature. From 1840, with reference to public transport, education, or other services restricted. Of course, more begging, more victimhood. Public transport, education, and other services restricted. So what? Start your own. See, they make this stuff a problem when it actually wasn't a problem. Because the original Americans, our families, didn't have a problem traveling. They didn't have a problem with education because education was at home. Your parents, your family educated / nurtured / nourished you. They didn't send you off to strangers to be educated. But it seems as though this is a push to get you in some schools and to be educated by strangers as opposed to your own family and other services. From the beginning, we've been providing our own services. But that slowed down tremendously. Now the burden is on someone else to provide for you. And you get mad when they don't provide for you. To use by black people under the former system known as Jim Crow, which enforced racial segregation in the southern states of the United States. The propaganda is real. This is a figure of Thomas Dartmouth Rice in the role of Jim Crow. The Anglo-Saxon or Caucasian man who his act was to put black paint on him and try to imitate a nigger. 1836 to 1840. Figure of Thomas Rice in the role of Jim Crow, made in Staffordshire about 1835. Jim Crow was based on a caricature of an elderly, disabled Southern African American, Southern American, stable hand. Stable hand is a job. It's a job. Contrary to what you believe, the original Americans dealt with horses and stables as well. The character and associated song Jump Jim Crow became part of Rice's signature act by 1832. After the United States Civil War, the name of Jim Crow was associated with legislation enacted in southern states to enforce racial segregation and to deny Americans their civil liberties. Yale University, Yale Macmillan Center, Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, the History of Minstrel Shows and Jim Crow. Instructor Jonathan Holloway. Seminar participants worked with a range of primary sources to interpret the shifting social, economic, political, psychological, and cultural trauma associated with this set of racial practices. Minstrel shows was the first example of the way American popular culture would exploit and manipulate blacks and their culture to entertain and benefit whites. Let's go over that again. Minstrel shows was the first example of the way foreigners' culture would exploit and manipulate Americans and their culture to entertain and benefit foreigners, whites. Minstrels were portrayed as happy-go-lucky slaves, happy-go-lucky workers, happy-go-lucky Americans who were too simple to accomplish anything but uncomplicated farm work. Uncomplicated farm work. How many farmers out there would agree that farm work is uncomplicated? What uncomplicated farm work? The uncomplicated farm work that the Americans, your family, taught to hundreds of foreigners when they came here through Ellis Island. How did they learn this soil? How did they learn what grew here? Someone taught them. Contrary to what you believe, the people who came here through Ellis Island, these people were not the king's men. These are the same people who you talk to someone today and they'll tell you their great grandparent came here rubbing 2 nickels together. And how did that work out? How do you become successful from having 2 nickels? Today, if you had 2 nickels or the equivalent of today's value of the money, you would be homeless. Jim Crow is considered to be the first minstrel character created by Thomas Dartmouth Daddy Rice in 1828. Rice was an unemployed actor who said he came upon a black man singing the song Jump Jim Crow, so he stole it. So he stole it. That's what they do. That's what foreigners do. They come and steal your stuff. They come and steal it, turn it into a business, sell it back to you. Rice was an unemployed actor. It's 1828. He's an actor in 1828. He's acting. In other words, he's pushing an agenda. Rice was an unemployed actor who said he came upon a black man, an American, singing the song Jump Jim Crow. Understand, he said a black man. 1828. Wasn't no slave. Wasn't no African. Wasn't no African American. This is 1828. You remember 1828, Webster's Dictionary, American Dictionary of the English Language. He described an American as the Aboriginal peoples saw by the Europeans when they first got here. The copper-colored races. Ain't no such thing as a black. You never seen a black human being. In 1828, Rice, when he said he came upon a black man, he meant he came upon an American, singing the song Jump Jim Crow, and imitated that man's mannerisms to construct what became known as the iconic Jim Crow. So all this Jim Crow started because an unemployed actor was imitating an American. And now it's been switched to be synonymous with segregation and all things of that manner. When in actuality, it started because some unemployed actor, some unemployed European actor was imitating an American man. He imitated the man's mannerisms to construct what became known as the iconic Jim Crow. No one knows if the man was an old black slave. I'm pretty sure the man was working, but he was laboring for himself and his family. I mean, these people have to keep the lie alive. Don't you understand? Within 10 years of the character's creation, the term Jim Crow was used as a negative nickname for African Americans. No such thing as an African American. That's a new creature. We're talking 1828. We're talking an American. Call it like what it is. Within 10 years of the character's creation, the term Jim Crow was used as a negative nickname for Americans, along the same lines as racial epithets, coon, or darky. So just 10 years after this starving actor, this unemployed actor, yeah, I bet he didn't have no help getting that Jim Crow, that label, that name, power. Yeah, he needed help to do that. By the end of the 19th century, Jim Crow was more likely to be used to describe the state laws which limited freedoms and rights Americans gained as a result of the Civil War amendments during Reconstruction. Minstrel Man by Langston Hughes. Minstrel Man by Langston Hughes, written in 1932. Is wide with laughter, and my throat is deep with song. You do not think I suffer after I have held my pain so long? Because my mouth is wide with laughter, you do not hear my inner cry? Because my feet are gay with dancing, you do not know I die? Sounds like Langston Hughes was contributing to that propaganda. I'm not surprised, because it took people like you to push the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. I mean, you see them dancing around today trying to imitate you, right? Sometimes they look funny doing it. I mean, they put on a blackface too. People spray tan. They don't go sit out in the sun. That don't work too well. But they spray tan. And if you've ever seen the sunscreen under the UV ray, under the UV light, if you've seen how the sunscreen looks on their faces under the UV light, they are actually wearing blackface. Jump Jim Crow by Thomas Rice. First performed 1828, when Noah Webster said what an American was. Any of the copper-colored races found here by the Europeans. Correction. Not found here, because we weren't lost. Come, listen, all you gals and boys. I'm just from Tucky Ho. I'm going to sing a little song. My name's Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I went down to the river. I didn't mean to stay, but there I see so many gals I couldn't get away. I'm Roar on the fiddle and down and over Jenny. They say I play the scientific like Master Paganini. I cut so many monkey shines. I danced the gallopade. And when I done, I rest my head on shovel, hoe, or spade. I met Miss Dina Scrub one day. I give her such a bus. And then she turn and slap my face and make a mighty fuss. The other gals, they get in a fight. I tell them, wait a bit. I'd have them all just one by one as I to it fit. I whip the lion of the west. I eat the alligator. I whip the lion of the west. I eat the alligator. I put more water in my mouth than boil 10 load of potato. The way they bake the whole cake, Virginia never tire. They put the dough up on the foot and stick 'em in the fire. The whole cake, cornbread. And he speak about lions, right? Just like he speak about alligator. I whip the lion of the west. I whip the lion of the west. I eat the alligator. I put more water in my mouth than boil 10 load of potato. See how he talking? He's trying to speak American. Like when you hear what you would term some country white folks from the South, and you think that they are the original people because they have a, quote, Southern drawl. All it is imitation. When their people came here, they spoke all manner of languages, Italian, German, all those kind of languages. They didn't speak American. Most didn't even speak English. They learned that here. They had to. How do you come to a place and survive if you don't know the language of the place? That's why so many of your people, just like so many of my people in the census record, it said that they spoke English, but they didn't read or write it. There was no purpose to be reading and writing. They had other things to do. Some of my relatives were farmers, some were blacksmiths. They had other things to do. They took care of their families. They were outside with their feet in the soil. They were connected to nature. And today, you're separated from nature. You're separated from nature, which makes your existence an illusion. National Geographic, who was Jim Crow? 50 years ago, the Voting Rights Act targeted the laws and practices of Jim Crow. This is from grades 3 through 12. Thomas Rice was a white stage performer in the early 1830s. This is lazy. He was a white. It says he was a white American. No, he wasn't an American. He was a foreigner. He was an immigrant. He's not from this soil. And it says he was white, which would mean that he probably was from Great Britain or something like that. because Benjamin Franklin once said that all the people, Italian, German, and such, all these people were swarthy. He said the English were the only whites that he knew of. Don't quote me on that. You go read that for yourself, but it's close. In 1944, the Detroit, Michigan chapter of the NAACP held a mock funeral for him, for Thomas Rice, the guy who stole the song Jim Crow and tried to imitate the brother who he stole it from by doing all manner of weird shit. I'm pretty sure it didn't have no rhythm in when he was doing it. Excuse me. In 1944, the Detroit, Michigan chapter of the NAACP held a mock funeral for him, for an actor, for an unemployed actor. In 1963, participants in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom symbolically buried him. Racial discrimination existed throughout the United States in the 20th century, but it had a special name in the South: Jim Crow. See that? See that? See how your mind is played with? See how your mind is molded without you even knowing it? It's molded like silly putty, like clay. U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson tried to bury Jim Crow by signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. He buried Jim Crow by getting you to vote, getting you to participate. See? Participation is the name of the game. Your energy, your participating means that you participate in erasing you. You thought you needed to be governed. Not all of us, not all of our people, all of our families did not want to participate in this. The Voting Rights Act and its predecessor, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, fought racial discrimination laws in the South by banning legal segregation in public accommodations and outlawing the poll taxes and tests that were used to stop Americans from voting. So, the Civil Rights Act, it fought for you. It fought for a business owner to not be able to tell you couldn't come in their establishment and you couldn't do it either. But the main thing was to get you to vote, to participate. Today, we still use the term Jim Crow to describe that system of segregation and discrimination in the South. But the system's namesake isn't actually Southern. Jim Crow came from the North. Thomas Rice, a white man, was born in New York City. See? If you don't pay attention, your thoughts will be given to you and you will eat them up. And you'll regurgitate them and you'll tell them to someone else. You'll teach them to your children. You'll allow someone else to teach them to your children. It says, but the system's namesake, it's a system. You hear what I'm saying? It's a system. Jim Crow has went from a song that a brother was singing one day somewhere in the South, he was singing it. And this unemployed actor came and bit the song and bit homie mannerisms and all that. It says Jim Crow came from the South. Thomas Rice, a white man, was born in New York City in 1808. He wasn't Jim Crow. Why would they say it came from the North? Why would they call Thomas Rice Jim Crow? Jim Crow was the subject of a little rhyme or something like that a nigga was singing in the South. And in the early 1830s, he began performing the act that would make him famous. He painted it. I guess his people found this funny. But let's take it further. I think his people enjoyed it. I think they would have enjoyed the brother who actually made it up more. He began performing the act that would make him famous. He painted his face black and did a song and dance he claimed were inspired by a black person he saw or an American he saw. It said by an enslaved black person, but they say they didn't know if the man was enslaved or not. And how could they tell if he was enslaved when he was probably chilling, singing a song, and homie stole it from him? To be honest with you, the whole thing sound like BS to me. I actually, right now, as I read more, I believe it less and less. It seems like he just making it up. Rice's routine was a hit in New York City, New York, one of many places in the North where working class whites could see blackface minstrelsy, which was quickly becoming a dominant form of theater and a leading source for popular music in the United States. Imitating you made him famous. I'm not saying whether the imitation was good or bad. It probably was bad because I'm pretty sure he didn't have any rhythm. Experts don't really know how a racist performance in the North came to represent racial laws and policies in the South. Right. I guess that's what makes them experts, because sounds like they were thinking for themselves. Sometimes in history, a movie comes out or a book comes out and it just changes the language and you can point at it, says David Pilgrim, director of the Jim Crow Museum and vice president for diversity and inclusion at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan. Remember, Jim Crow became a system. A system. David Pilgrim, director of the Jim Crow Museum. The Jim Crow Museum. How do you get a museum out of an unemployed actor biting a song from a brother sitting on a stoop somewhere? Chilling. Vice president for diversity and inclusion. And in just this case, he says, I think it just evolved. However, it happened, the new meaning stuck. Yeah, I bet it did. Library of Congress, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a long struggle for freedom, epilogue. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 hastened the end of legal Jim Crow. It secured African Americans, properly Americans, no such thing as African Americans during that time. African Americans is a new creation, a new creature. Equal access to restaurants, transportation, and other public facilities. They need your participation in their restaurants and transportation and other public facilities, so there won't be a need for you to create your own. I don't know how else to say this. So if you weren't allowed to go, if they didn't make it law, if they didn't mandate it, that you were allowed to go in others' restaurants, transportation, and other public facilities, then guess what? It's almost like they're saying that you wouldn't have had your own and that you didn't have your own, but you did. But because now you can go get a piece of pumpkin pie from Lily's Diner, you didn't go get no sweet potato pie from Aunt Hattie's spot. It enabled blacks, women, and other minorities. What other minorities? And why is blacks and women minorities? How do you come to a new land portion, a new soil portion, and become the majority? What, did the original Americans stop having children? It enabled blacks, women, and other minorities to break down barriers in the workplace. It also made access to equal education a reality for many Southern and Northern African Americans who began attending integrated schools in the wake of the Act's enforcement. See, these are the real goals. Because they need your children. They have to teach your children in order to shape them and mold them and give them this illusion to carry with them, soon erasing your story, erasing who you really are by educating you. Educate is synonymous with nurture and nourish. Get you out of the home. Get a stranger nurturing and nourishing you. It also made access to equal education a reality for an example of this is Spelman, named after Rockefeller's wife. Spelman is Rockefeller's wife's maiden name. And now it's supposed to be a, quote, black school. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968 expanded these protections to voting and housing. Oh, voting and housing. Voting, your participation in being governed. In being governed. Same thing today. If you want to know about yesterday, look at today. What is pushed on you so hard? Voting. Housing. Why would indigenous Americans, your family, your lineage, your ancestors, why would they have to legislate and do all these things for housing? They are the people of the soil. Before any foreigners came here, our people was just fine. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which barred employment discrimination based on sex as well as race, color, religion, and national origin, energized the women's movement and led to the founding of the National Organization for Women in 1966, emboldened by the remarkable achievement of the 1964 Act. The future of civil rights, like its past, will be shaped by citizens' participation in lobbying, litigation, politics, and public protest. The future of civil rights, like its past, will be shaped by citizens' participation in lobbying, litigation, politics, and public protest. You think people just get up and protest for all manner of things just because somebody say, you know what, I'm going to join a protest. 1,000 people just get together. This is organized. This is organized with a purpose. The organizers have intentions. Public protests. You know what public protests are? You hooping and hollering. Just like you know what the internet is and all these manner of platforms and streaming services and all this stuff, when people have issues with something that's happening, you know what people do? They talk. public protests, they hoop and holler. They talk loud. They don't do nothing. Just like online, people got a lot of opinions. They constantly say what they don't disagree with and what they don't like and all this other type of stuff, but they don't do nothing. The future of civil rights. This is a blueprint. All these things that happen were blueprints. They were written. Just like I've thought to myself how people, when things in the Bible come to pass, I guess, people say, oh, this came to pass just like it said in the Bible. Wow. Have you ever thought that the Bible just might be a blueprint? It might be a run of show. And the reason it's coming to pass is because it's not coming to pass. It's happening in the order it's supposed to happen in. Yes, the production company is making the movie run smoothly. The elaborate show, Take 5, will be shaped by citizens' participation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 contains 11 segments or titles. Title 1, Voting Rights, barred unequal application of state voter registration requirements for federal election. Barred unequal application of state voter registration requirements for federal elections. Title 1, Voting. Vote. Whatever. Title 2, Public Accommodations, prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin in certain places of public accommodation, such as hotels, restaurants, and places of entertainment. Assimilate into our places and accommodations and restaurants and hotels and entertainment, so you can stop building yours. Title 3, desegregation of public facilities, permitted the U.S. Justice Department to sue to secure desegregation of certain public facilities owned, operated, or managed by any state or subdivision of a state. This is all propaganda for the masses. Title 4, desegregation of public education, authorized the U.S. Attorney General to receive complaints alleging denials of equal protection, to investigate those complaints, and to file suit in U.S. District Court to seek desegregation of the school. Also authorized the Secretary of Education to provide funds to school boards to assist their desegregation efforts. Like when the National Guard had to assist the little sisters or whatever going into the new Anglo-Saxon or Caucasian, or I guess properly foreigner school. What parent would put their child through that? Where was the parents of that little sister at? I'm almost inclined to call them parents disgusting. Title 5, Civil Rights Commission, addressed procedures for the Civil Rights Commission, broadened its duties, and extended its life through January 1968. Its duties included investigating allegations that citizens were deprived of their right to vote or to have their vote properly counted. It also studied legal developments related to a denial of equal protection of the law, particularly in the domains of voting, education, housing, employment, public accommodation, transportation, and the administration of justice. Title 6, non-discrimination in federally assisted programs, prohibited discrimination by recipients of federal funds on the basis of race, color, and national origin, all to get you to participate. This is all so that you can participate in your own demise. Title 7, Equal Employment Opportunity. Outlawed employment discrimination by businesses affecting commerce with at least 25 employees on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. All these things are to sneak into your personal life. Fighting Jim Crow in the 19th Century South, the Untold Story. Melissa Malusky. This is from blackpast.org. Blackpast.org. And Melissa Malusky has a book. It's called Litigating Across the Color Line, Civil Cases Between Black and White Southerners, from the End of Slavery to Civil Rights. Most historians have considered the period between 1877, the end of Reconstruction, and 1900 to be the nadir, or the low point in terms of African American political rights, or properly American political rights. No such thing as an African American. That's a new creature. Some have even described it as the worst period for blacks. There is no such thing as a black. Worst period for Americans. A black is non-existent. You've never met a black human being in your life, or a white one, since emancipation. Melissa Malusky does find a surprising number of court cases where blacks won their lawsuits despite white power and the then dominant ideology of white supremacy. This is get your little throw up buckets. Get your throw up buckets. Hear the words come, hear the hijacks come. You might have to vomit. Melissa, I'm gonna try to do my best to translate this. Melissa Malusky does find a surprising number of court cases where Americans won their lawsuit despite foreigners' so-called power and the then dominant ideology of foreign supremacy. How many of your ancestors agreed that a foreigner was supreme over them? Not many, I'm sure. Don't insult them like that. As a young doctorate student, digging through various archives to find a topic for my dissertation, I struck up a conversation with a curator at the Georgia Archives. I explained I was interested in studying race in the U.S. South, but hadn't found the right angle yet to approach the topic. The curator suggested that I take a look at the state Supreme Court cases involving African Americans, properly Americans, in the archives collection, noting that the cases were rarely examined by historians, but were a very rich source. The file for each case was hundreds of pages long and contained detailed records of the testimony in the trial, as well as petitions, accounts of proceedings, and appeals. One of the first cases I encountered involved a man named William Walker, the son of a wealthy white slaveholder and an enslaved mother. The son of a wealthy white slaveholder, a wealthy white employer, and an enslaved mother. Usually because the man is the head of the household, they would call the mother and the children the man's slaves. A bit of context. Slaveholder and enslaved mother. I have to, and I know it takes longer to do this, but I have to give context behind these things because they're very confusing. They will have you confused. They're usually with these articles, they're usually all over the place. In one paragraph, you'll hear African, Black, African American. You'll hear all manner of things. When his father died, he emancipated his 7 enslaved children. See? When his father died, he emancipated his 7 enslaved children and their 4 mothers and directed all of his property to be used to settle them in the African country of Liberia. The emancipated Americans, with 17-year-old William Walker in their midst, moved to Liberia in 1859, just 2 years before the beginning of the U.S. Civil War. Almost 2 decades later, in 1878, a 30-year-old Walker returned to America to initiate a court case against his former masters, his former employers' relatives, claiming that they had never sent over the vast bulk of the bequest left for settlement in Liberia. Several aspects of this case shed interesting insights on black litigants' experiences in courts in the U.S. South. I was particularly interested in the way in which Walker marshaled white support for his claim, including hiring a white lawyer, and seemingly working with his lawyer to gain witnesses who testified on his behalf. Walker's own testimony was also fascinating, shedding light on his experiences as a slave, his life in Liberia, and his interactions with whites in the South upon his return. In addition, Walker seemed to be shaping his testimony to strengthen the claims of his case and persuade white Southern jurors to decide in his favor. He testified, for instance, that he had no intention of staying in the U.S. South after the trial, thus removing any concerns that white jury members might have about a newly wealthy black man joining their community if they awarded him his claim. So the white jury members might have had concerns about a newly wealthy black man joining their community. Oh, he would join their po community. He wealthy, but he gonna go stay amongst the po whites. I was surprised, as well as Walker's initial legal success. I was surprised as well at Walker's initial legal success. A case between a black man from Liberia, a case between an American who moved to Liberia and wealthy white landowners and wealthy foreign landowners in Georgia seemed in many ways as if it would be an open and shut case for a white or largely all white jury in post-Reconstruction Georgia. Yet I found that the jury in the county court found that the former slaves were entitled to recover almost $40,000. It was only when the white heirs appealed to the Supreme Court of Georgia in 1880 that the higher court overturned the earlier decision. There are things that I want to speak of in terms of when you see certain things like wealthy white landowners, and we're talking in the year 1880. I want to touch on things like the Homestead Act and things of this nature, but a show on those things will be forthcoming. Let's shake it. I built up a list of well over 1,000 cases that seem to involve black litigants, American litigants in various Southern archives. I then began traveling to archives in 8 states around the South to try to unearth the archival case files of these cases that I had discovered. To my relief, the vast majority of the case files still survived. And like the cases that I had discovered in Georgia archives, the records were often extensive, numbering hundreds of pages. Here I found more fascinating stories. Perhaps my favorite case was that of Mary Ray, a young American woman from North Carolina who brought a civil suit in 1889 against the local county commissioners, the most powerful white men in the county where she lived. Her suit pointed to a deed to her father to claim the land upon which the local courthouse and jail were located. It's okay if you got 5, 10 acres somewhere in the backwoods. But she's speaking of a deed to her father to a deed to her father to claim the land upon which the local courthouse and jail were located. Clearly well aware of just what she was up against, Ray testified that a change of venue was needed as she could not obtain justice in this case, in this cause, in said county because of the interested nature of local leaders and judges. She explained that besides being gentlemen of marked personal influence and magnetism in said county, around which many interests are drawn and adhered, they, as such commissioners, have under the law control and supervision of the jury system, as well as all other official matters appertaining to the affairs of the county. In the end, Ray experienced a number of delays and difficulties in obtaining witnesses to appear and eventually lost the suit. However, her boldness in taking on these powerful white men, these powerful foreigners in the post-Reconstruction South, riveted me. This has to do with families going to different places around what we term as North America, and at one time being in close proximity to one another. If you can imagine having 200 or 300, having a couple hundred roughly family members all in one place, it's a force to be reckoned with, as opposed to a woman bringing us a case for some land that the police station sits on. We're much more powerful when we have our entire family with us. In a remarkable number of cases, the American litigants did win their suits. They did win their suits. This is much different from what you're used to. I turned to the quantitative analysis to determine how many suits black litigants won, American litigants won against foreign litigants, and found that they won 59% of the 980 such suits I located across 8 state Supreme Courts. There was the case in Kentucky in 1910 where an American laundress named Rebecca Sally fell into a large open hole on the street as she made her way to church service. Sally sued the city to recover damages and obtain the value of a year's worth of wages and her lawyer's fees from the city. There was the suit in 1935 of Mary Jackson, who refused to give up her 10-acre plot of land in Mississippi when a foreign neighbor sought to lay claim to it, only leaving when an anonymous group of white men, of foreigners, came during the darkest hours of the night and brutally beat her. Jackson then initiated a civil case against the white neighbor, the foreign neighbor, to confirm her claim to the property, and the highest court in Mississippi upheld her ownership of the land. This is what happens when the family is fragmented. And when the family is fragmented, see, you have those who stay on the soil that they've always known. But we get older, people get older, and they make the transition. And there aren't as many family members there. And not having family members there is not having protection, because you have to have protection against these foreigners. And look at it now. Our relatives, our extended families, for generations have now been a part of the foreigners' militia. Let's shake it. The central question for me was how American litigants managed to both litigate and often win these civil suits at a time in which they faced increasing disenfranchisement and segregation and experienced inequality in the criminal justice system because they didn't see it that way. If something was theirs, they wanted it back. American litigants often saw their participation in these civil cases as having life-altering economic consequences, and so usually did all they could to win their suits. This included hiring white lawyers and using their knowledge of the law and of local race relations to shape their testimonies in ways that would be viewed most favorably by judges and juries. Remember our participation. We are still participating today with everything, every aspect of life. We are participating with foreigners. After 1890, the courts were often more accessible to Americans than other branches of government. In part, this was because whites or foreigners saw the courts as less threatening than the black vote, than the American vote. This is from the Harvard Gazette. When men were men, and women too. Ken Gewertz, Gazette staff. Through playbills, posters, photos, cross-dressing on the stage brings history to life. Cross-dressing in the theater has a long and fascinating history, going back at least to the ancient Greeks. This is a picture of Danny LaRue, 1927, was England's most famous dame. See, William Rice, the one who bit. Thomas Rice, the one who they called Jim Crow, who actually bit Jim Crow. It was a song from a brother chilling in the South. At least they say. At this point, I don't really know if I even believe it. It became a system. You hear me? It became a system to this day. The two words Jim Crow are mentioned to this day. They are still a system. Cross-dress. And what did he do? He put on blackface. He put black paint on his face and he imitated an older American man. Cross-dressing in the theater has a long and fascinating history going back at least to the ancient Greeks. Remember Danny LaRue, he cross-dressing in this picture. 1927 was England's most famous dame. I mean, he got on a ballroom dress. It ain't like, with the spider eyelashes and the huge globs of lipstick and 7 layers of makeup on the face and all manner of crazy outfits. Nah, he got a ballroom dress on. Honorary curator Lawrence Sinelick, the Fletcher Professor of Oratory at Tufts University, gave a lecture on the subject June 18th that helped to explain why the spectacle of a man playing a woman or vice versa has had such a long run in the theater. From the dawn of time, women's presence in the theater has been the exception rather than the rule, said Sinelick. The theater is grounded in religion, and having women on stage was not considered decorous. Their realm is at home. Oh my God. From the dawn of time, women's presence in the theater has been the exception rather than the rule, said Senelik. The theater is grounded in religion. Remember, the theater is grounded in religion, and having women on stage was not considered decorous. Their realm is at home. The theater is grounded in religion. And here's our friend Danny LaRue, 1927, at the theater that's grounded in religion. Shout out to your religion. The irony is that the religion from which ancient Greek theater sprang was the worship of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, whose rites were carried out principally by women. But when these rites evolved into theater, women were banished from the stage and their parts taken by men. Here are a few pictures, a few small pictures. The baritone, the first one, all the way to the left is the baritone. Julian Eltinge was the first female impersonator to star in a Broadway show, with the first man who was impersonating a female. The middle is John Liston as Mole Flagon in The Lord of the Manor, watercolor portrait by Samuel Day Wilde in 1814. This is 1814. I know where my people were in 1814. You should too. And if you don't, find out, because this was happening. This was happening in 1814. The men were dressing, males were dressing like females, females were dressing like males. And all the way to the right is Abdallah in the pantomime, The 40 Thieves, was played by Louisa Fairbrother, 1845. These are women's roles being played by men. And in this picture, we have the sheet music for the Lulu Waltz, was illustrated with the color lithograph engraved by R. Teller of Lulu himself, acrobat Lulu Farina. This is an acrobat. This is a male who is dressed like a female. During the Restoration period, there was a vogue for women playing male rakes like Mashith in John Gay's The Beggar's Opera. Males specialized in playing characters of the opposite sex, often portraying older women or women of the lower classes. Here we have Neil Burgess, made a successful career on the American stage, playing sharp, commonsensical New England matrons. His widow, Badcock above, was widely quoted. This is Neil Burgess. He is playing a female. A number of actresses, such as the British Helen Weston, specialized in playing romantic male roles. Also popular at this time were women playing young boys, especially those of the lower classes. As you can see, this did not just start. Jim Crow was just the beginning. As Senelik pointed out, the ultimate example of this strategy is the traditional casting of a woman in the role of Peter Pan. In America, the all-male minstrel show also used female impersonation as a way of appeasing straight-laced provincial audiences. In America, the all-male minstrel show also used female impersonation as a way of appeasing straight-laced provincial audiences. I would say that this minstrel show, as well as the above that we've just read, are all propaganda tools, no different from the sardine can slave ship. Here we go. Some of the most popular plays of the 19th and 20th centuries have featured men impersonating women, usually out of necessity rather than choice. Charlie's Aunt by Brandon Thomas debuted on Broadway in 1893 and revived many times since. In 1893, our families were farmers, blacksmiths, doing all manner of things, railroads and such. Um, and Charlie's Aunt by Brandon Thomas debuted on Broadway in 1893 and revived many times since is a prime example of the genre. Most recent versions of this basic device include I Was a Male War Bride with Cary Grant, Some Like It Hot with Tony Curtis, and Jack Lemmon, and the 1980s television show Bosom Buddies starring Peter Scolari and Tom Hanks, and it continues today. With all manner of men opting for the dress. Glamour drag, a genre that grew in popularity during the first half of the century, began with such performers as the vaudeville star Julian Eltinge, who insisted he was a man's man in his private life, and the comedian Bert Savoy, considered to be a model for Mae West. Imitation, flattery, strategy. Do the right thing.